give you a ton of information in the next 50 odd minutes. And because I'm mindful of time and your sort of time, I'm going to move through some slides quite quickly, but please go back to them. You'll get the slides afterwards and just absorb and reflect, as I certainly would if I was listening. So yeah, so this is me, and this talk was originally written for trainees, for supporting trainees, as that's primarily my role, but actually it applies to everybody. I'm going to start with basics, so some definitions of what neurodiversity is. So neurodiversity is it's complicated, it's scary to talk about if you don't feel comfortable or confident. And actually, language is really important. Language matters in so many areas. So here's some of the language around neurodiversity. Essentially, it's the diversity or variation of the cognitive functioning of individuals. And when we talk about neurodiverse, we talk about people being neurodiverse, and we can talk about individuals being neurodivergent. And here we're sort of splitting between nouns and adjectives. And I just find that's quite a useful thing. And it's also worth saying that, you know, I'm really interested in this. I talk about it a lot. I still get this wrong, and I probably will during this talk. And I think that's really important to say, that we're all on a learning journey, as I certainly am. Now, there's quite a lot of you, so I'm not going to ask the question and get responses. But one of the questions I always ask is, this image is from the internet. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you look at this and have a look for a few seconds, think about what this tells us about how we see neurodiversity as a society. Just give a few seconds. So one of the things I noticed about this slide is it talks about the problems and the challenges. What it doesn't do is talk about the talents and the skills and the opportunities. And I think that's really, really important. And actually part of my talk will be including examples of actually the talents, the opportunities, and the way we can support better neuroinclusivity in the workplace and actually generally in the world. So a few facts about neurodiversity: 15 to 20% of people are neurodivergent. I used to have 1 in 6. I've changed it to 1 in 5 now, because I think the more we understand it and we learn about ourselves and others, I think the smaller this number is going to get. You know, at the moment, I think 1 in 5. And like I said, it's a difference in the way that people's brains are wired from what we consider to be neurotypical. So the 4 in 5 would be considered neurotypical, and that's the median, the average of how we interpret things as individuals. So neurodiverse people interpret, think, and process differently to neurotypical people. And we often think about neurodiversity as a condition, so we medicalize it. Some neurodivergence is considered a health condition, and this is really important for reasons I'll explain in a bit. And so some neurodivergence can be formally diagnosed, and this can support workplace adjustments, sometimes called reasonable adjustments, and sometimes medication. For example, with ADHD, medication can be really, really beneficial. And it's important to know that we don't all sit in our understanding or our personal experience of neurodivergence in the same way. So some people may think that they're neurodivergent, that they have some of the traits, and may be seeking a diagnosis. And there are long waiting lists for diagnosis, and they're increasing the more we learn about it and the more we recognise traits in ourselves. And some people want a diagnosis because they want to understand more about themselves, but they may also want to seek help and support in their lives, in the workplace. And as society, we know that people don't always wish to disclose their differences, their neurodivergence, and that can be due to shame, fear of bias, or discrimination, because we know that does happen. And some people may have traits, but they may not identify as neurodivergent. They may not want to, they may not be aware that they may be neurodivergent. So there are so many different ways in which we come to this. And I think as a society, we are very good at recognising the challenges. That slide demonstrated that, the previous slide, but not always so good at recognising the talents and the opportunities that it brings. And I think for the workforce, that's really, really important. And when I was putting these slides together, one of the things I was thinking about is, how do we all come to neurodiversity? Where do we sit? How does it impact us? What is our experience? And I just thought of a few different ways it comes to people, and I just put them down, here, thinking some people know they're neurodivergent, but they may mask it or hide it because of those fear of sort of discrimination. Some people may not know. Some people may have congenital kind of neurodivergence. It's who they have been since birth. Some people have acquired neurodivergence, and that can be due to illness or an injury. So there are many different types as well. And so I just think that's really interesting, that one size really doesn't fit all, and we're all individuals. Now, for neurodivergent conditions, where we talk about it with a medical model, people who have a diagnosis are included under the protected characteristic of disability under the Equality Act 2010. And neurotypical people don't have to make declarations to human resources or occupational health about how their brain works and how they process things and think about things. Yet neurodivergent people may feel forced to do so to get the adjustments and support they need. And we call this neurotypical privilege. And many types of neurodivergence are characterized, and I'm really uncomfortable with this, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5. So you can kind of see why we have this stigma around neurodivergence because of labeling, because of medicalizing it. Although sometimes as a condition, it's important for adjustments, for support. And it's worth noting that neurodiversity and mental health aren't the same thing, but neurodivergent people may be more at risk of developing mental ill health. And that can be partly because of experiences in life. And those things can fluctuate and change as we go through those different stages of our lives and the environment that we are living in and working in. And the other thing I should say is at the bottom of all of these pages, there are some links to evidence and interesting reading material. So there's lots to read up on around this. Now, I've talked about the medical model a little bit, but essentially the medical model is where we look at what is wrong with a person and how we can fix it, rather than what the barriers are and what they need. So the social model is different to the medical model in that it's more balanced. It sees neurodiversity as a variation and part of normal human life, in that we are all different. And it looks at breaking down those barriers and giving people a more chance of an equitable society and of a workplace. And I do honestly believe we are, as we learn more about neurodiversity, we are starting to move towards a social model where we are more neuroinclusive. Now, I think these are really good examples. There's quite a leading person, I think, in neurodiversity, and one of their books is at the bottom there, and these are from those references. And as a scientist, I found this really easy to understand. So they talk about spiky profiles, but they also have a normal distribution curve. And actually, if you think about it, neurotypical people, this sort of 80%, 70, 80% are sitting in the middle. And that's how society works. It meets the needs of the neurotypical people because that's the majority. But actually, we look at the challenges and the problems, I hate that word, for neurodivergent people, and we can look on the left side of that curve in that minority, where there may be challenges around numeracy, reading, writing, communication, sensory challenges. But actually, we often don't look at the right-hand side of the curve, because that bell curve has the equal distribution on the right-hand side as well. And actually on that side, what we can look at are the skills and talents, which also relate to those same themes, for example, around numeracy, reading, communication, etc. And the spiky profiles I quite like. I think this is mine, actually, because I am super organised, really good at attention to detail. When I was being introduced by Andy, I was actually changing something on the first slide because I got the date wrong, and that really upset me. So attention to detail, I'm really spiky in that area. But actually, I'm not very coordinated. I sort of walk into things all the time. I'm very uncoordinated. So actually, you can see my profile for that. It's much nearer the centre. So I'm quite spiky. And I just think I'm very visual as well. So I think that's a really nice way to represent me. And these examples are given in this book, which I would really recommend reading. If you're thinking, what on earth is she talking about? Here are some examples of neurodiversity that you will have heard of, and some that you may not have. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is commonly understood. Autism spectrum disorder, ASD, Dyslexia, you will have come across. Tourette's syndrome, you've probably heard of. But there are other things you may not have, like misophonia, dyspraxia, hyperlexia, for example. There are many examples, and this is not an exhaustive list either. So I thought I'd just give some examples that you may have heard of. So if we start with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, which you may be familiar, can be characterized by repetitive patterns of behavior, difficulties around communication, difficulties understanding change, and processing information. So I'm very good at listing the challenges. It's really easy because you can probably recognize some. But actually, if we look at the strengths, attention to detail is a real strength. Following rules and sequences and logic is a strength. And retaining knowledge is a real strength as well. So I think we could all list some challenges, but not as easily think about strengths, and that's really important here. And also, when we talk about autism, we think of it being linear. So you're on a line, maybe less autistic or more autistic, awful. It's not like that at all. It's actually more of a circular kind of model with lots of different aspects, and every single person is individual and will be impacted in certain areas differently and have strengths in other areas. And there will be differences for everyone. I'd really recommend the Exceptional Individuals website. It's really helpful. Dyslexia, we probably know, affects skills involved in reading and spelling, and also can have other challenges around memory and timekeeping and information processing. And it's really important to know it's because the brain functions differently. It's not because someone can't spell or a deficiency in their language or ability to learn. It's not. It's because the brain functions differently. And actually, I'm not dyslexic, so I didn't quite understand. And I was recommended this book, The Gift of Dyslexia. I would absolutely recommend it. It helped me to understand what it is like for a dyslexic person. And also someone who I know who's dyslexic said it's the first time they'd actually seen something that described what life was like for them. So I think it's a really powerful book. Some of the strengths of dyslexic people: creativity, problem solving, spatial awareness, for sure. I do not have that skill. Ability to see that bigger picture. And the thing is, when I've looked at these strengths, if I just go back to the previous slide as well, if you think about those strengths, are they not things that we're looking for in the healthcare scientist workforce? Because that really struck me when I was writing these slides. These are the things we are looking for and we should grab hold of. So there's a huge opportunity, I believe, for the healthcare scientist profession to actually really grab those skills of our neurodivergent populations. If we look at ADHD, we know it can be characterized by inattentiveness and hyperactivity. It's worth noting that not everybody is impacted by hyperactivity. So sometimes we refer to ADD as well. And again, this is reiterating the fact that people are individuals. Some of the strengths, again, really good for scientists: hyperfocus, problem solving. And also in autism on that slide, but on this slide, some of the challenges that people may have is around executive functioning. And that's essentially getting stuff done, those functions that we all do. And executive function can be something like making a cup of tea. If you think about it, how do you list all the things you have to do? There's a list of kind of tasks you do within that. We can group executive functioning into these 6 areas of memory, inhibition, emotional regulation, problem solving, self-awareness, and self-motivation. And I'll talk about this a bit more. I would also recommend the I Have ADHD podcast, which is where I got this information from, and they kindly gave me permission to share it. This was taken from some of their podcasts, and I learned so much from this. So some of the challenges in these areas for people with ADHD can relate to completing tasks. And you can see here the languages around trainees, because this is who I originally wrote it for. So it's essentially getting stuff done, and that can be in your personal life or also at work. So being late, not completing tasks that you've been asked to do, struggling to understand what you need to do to complete them, struggling to make decisions, doing things at the last minute. Those are all things I expect we've encountered in the workplace. And the really important thing to note here is that those can be associated with feelings of shame and guilt, which actually can make it harder for the person. So that's why it's so important that we recognize it, we understand, and we make the workplace a better place for our neurodivergent colleagues. And the important thing here as well is on this slide, can you see I've written may, and it's in bold because that's really important. Not every person with ADHD is impacted by all of these examples. It's absolutely individual, and it's really important that we treat people as individuals and we co-create with them when we're trying to make things better. You can download that slide as well. Well, there's a website link on that previous slide. I wanted to put a note to something you may not have heard of called a HSP, or a highly sensitive person. About 20% of the population are highly sensitive. And this is around a thing called sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS, and it's a normal genetic trait. So again, we're talking about differences, sin amongst the whole population, and it leads to greater emotional sensitivity. And that can be due to physical things, mental things, or emotional things around us, those sort of stimuli and our responses to it. So people who are high in that trait are known as HSPs. And there's increasing evidence around this. And it's interesting, it's related to alterations in genes relating to dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline, which are also seen in some other types of neurodiversity. I'm really interested to see how the evidence grows in this area. So like I said, those stimuli can be external or internal. And that can be really overwhelming to people, and that can be in personal life, but also in the workplace, which is set up generally for neurotypical people. And high sensitivity can also be seen next to other types of neurodiversity. None of these examples I've given stand alone. And HSPs can struggle more with mental ill health, such as anxiety and depression. And as a result of that, HSPs who know they're HSPs will often have a wellbeing toolkit. So they recognize signs when they're feeling like they're slipping into ill sort of health, and they'll do something about it. For example, going for a walk, listening to music, doing an activity that you love and sort of drives you and you're passionate about, for example. And it's worth noting that SPS is different to SPD, which is sensory processing disorder, and this impairs functioning to a greater level. So there are many kind of things that sound similar, but are actually different, and they impact people differently as well. And so I just wanted to comment on anxiety as well. We all know about anxiety, and there are several types. And we know that anxiety is this feeling of sort of fear or worry or unease. And it's absolutely natural in certain situations. I'd be worried if we didn't feel anxious sometimes. But having long-term chronic anxiety is not the same as worrying about things. And the worst thing you can say to someone with anxiety is, don't worry about it. And it's also worth noting that you may not know someone is anxious. They can be really high functioning and what we call masking it. So they're hiding that because of fear of sort of shame about their personality, their character, what they're feeling and thinking about things. And anxiety disorders are quite common amongst neurodivergent people. And as a woman, I should speak about fellow women. Much of the scientific research around neurodiversity relates to men and to children. And there's limited evidence, although it is increasing, around the needs of women. And we know that women often mask or hide their neurodiversity because as women, we have many social norms that we are still expected to fit in with. And people may learn that they're neurodivergent as a child, and this may not be discovered until an adult, 30s, 40s, 50s later. So it isn't always diagnosed at early stage. And also we know there are differences in gender. It can look different when we specifically think about autism in boys versus girls because of those natural differences in our emotions, behaviours and interests that we have stereotypically between the genders. And autism in women and girls, we know from evidence, can be hidden behind a mental health diagnosis. So actually, that leads a lot to sort of this middle-aged kind of diagnosis when you find it actually isn't a mental health diagnosis. Underlying that is neurodiversity. And we also know there's changes in our sort of life as we go through life. For women, menstruation and menopause can also exacerbate neurodivergent traits. So you can see how complicated this is. And this all links into this thing called intersectionality. And that's the way that our different characteristics of us as individuals intersect and overlap with one another. Because we put labels on things, we don't all have one label. So neurodivergent people may also be Black, they may be white, they may be female, they may be transgender. We don't just have one label. And multiple neurodivergences can also exist in individuals. And like I said, you can have other traits such as sensitivity. Now, really importantly, some people who are neurotypical and consider themselves as such may show neurodivergent traits. For example, attention to detail. It doesn't mean you are neurodivergent. And there's a real difference between showing traits and experiencing one aspect to being neurodivergent and being impacted. And part of the challenge is around recognizing that and understanding that the impact that being neurodivergent can have on individuals and supporting them as individuals. And linked to that is language. The power of language is so important. If we get it wrong, it can be really damaging to people. And there's a thing called microaggressions. We all know what aggression is, but microaggressions are these small, insensitive comments, assumptions, or statements that are said to people, and they target people. And they don't always do it on purpose either. It can happen to anybody, but it's often against groups with protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and that would include neurodivergent people. So language and words are really important, and if you get it wrong, it can have a negative and damaging impact on people, especially when they add up, like microaggressions do. And a word that we hear increasingly around neurodiversity is this word superpower. And it's really interesting because some people feel that their neurodiversity is their superpower. But really importantly, others do not think it's the superpower. They find that it inhibits them living the life they want to live. And so why would they think of it as a superpower? And this is another example of how it's not about making assumptions or putting labels. It's about speaking to people on an individual basis to see how they feel and how they are impacted. Now, in terms of microaggressions, here are some examples, some of which have been said to me, some of which have been reported to me from neurodivergent colleagues and trainees. So these are just some examples of things you shouldn't say. I mean, a really common one here, they don't look autistic. I mean, what does an autistic person look like? I'm so OCD about my desk. So you might be. But someone who is impacted by OCD, that can be really damaging because it's devaluing their experience of the world. We're all a little bit autistic. Please don't say that. I still hear that. We're not all a little bit. It's that devaluing of the experience of others. So the workplace is really, really good if you're neurotypical. That's who it's created for, the majority. And if you think about it, physical spaces, open plan spaces, bright lights, hot desking, that instability of desks, noise, and those unwritten social rules that we have around how we behave and how we communicate with each other. The assumption that neurotypical, the majority, is the right way to do it, and anything else is wrong and needs to be fixed so it can fit in and made to be normal. And I really think that's how the world works, quite honestly. And assumptions that if we make adjustments for people, that will only benefit that one individual who's asked for it, when actually that's not necessarily the case. It can benefit others as well. And we know that neurodivergent people, as a result of this, spend a lot of time and energy trying to fit in and be more normal and mask, and it is exhausting. And they do that because of that fear of discrimination, which they may have experienced in prior kind of times in their life or in previous jobs. So to move towards a more neuroinclusive workplace, we need to support people who ask us for help, but actually people who don't ask us for help as well. And not everyone has a formal neurodivergent diagnosis. We know this. And not everybody wants one. We don't all want that label. And people may not even be aware that they could be neurodivergent or have traits. So I think the way to do it is to start making the workplace inclusive for everybody. So when people know they're neurodivergent, they know they need adjustments, we we work with individuals and we give them adjustments where they need them. But how about we move away from the need for people to put themselves in that position where they've got to advocate and ask themselves? If we make the workplace more inclusive, we maybe have to do less of that. And then it's better for neurodivergent people, but also others. And there are many things we can do as individuals and as teams and departments and organisations and countries. And I honestly think if we give people conditions in which they can thrive, you will absolutely get the best out of everybody, and that being neurotypical people as well as neurodivergent people. Now, I've talked a bit about adjustments at work, reasonable adjustments, RAs, or workplace adjustments. So we know that neurodiversity is covered under disability in the Equality Act. And if we don't make reasonable adjustments, we can breach the Act. We can miss out on onboarding new talent. We can miss out on making the most of the people we already have on board because their talents may remain hidden, and they may also leave, so we may also lose that talent. But we know this sounds easy, but actually securing those adjustments is a real barrier for neurodivergent people, and it can cause loads of stress and anxiety. But reasonable adjustments are often small and inexpensive things that we can do. And organisations can use the Government Access to Work scheme to fund RAs. And there's a link to it here as well. So it's a UK scheme, and it can provide support, including to neurodivergent people. And it, examples of what it can do is provide grants to help people with costs of travelling, changes to the workplace, supporting mental health, support with interviews, for example. And neurodivergent individuals can apply for support through Access to Work. And here are some of the eligibility criteria, and you can see how it could apply. And I didn't know this until I started to sort of dig down into this, but people do not have to have a formal diagnosis to apply for this. So it's really inclusive. So what I'm going to do is move on to some examples of adjustments that we can make at work. Now, this one's for dyslexia, but the plus means it just doesn't apply to dyslexia. It can apply to other areas as well. So for example, a basic thing like written text, avoiding the use of italics, because that can be really hard for people to read and it can move around the page. Creating visual as well as written materials. I think that I'm a visual learner, so that's like heaven to me. I'm not dyslexia, but that's an example where that would benefit me as well. There's a thing you can download called Open Dyslexic that I'll show you in a minute on another slide. Avoiding the use of Comic Sans. I loved Comic Sans in the 1990s, but it's terrible if you look at it. Arial is much better, and it's hard for me to say because I'm not dyslexic, but Comic Sans, the letters can jump around the page more easily, I'm led to believe. Coloured paper overlays, filters for PCs and laptops, small things that we can do to make a real difference. And often those, if someone has a formal diagnosis, those pieces of advice will be given, so the person may know what they need. They may also not know what they need and may need support from you to identify their needs. In terms of assessments and exams, providing additional time. So often with a formal diagnosis, there will be advice to give people with dyslexia about 25% extra time in assessments. That's not a standard, but that's an example. And sometimes that may also include providing a scribe to read the questions. If you have a verbal assessment, also providing questions in a written form as well as just saying them can be really beneficial. Here's the Open Dyslexic typeface. It takes about 2 minutes to download. It's completely free. You can put it onto your computer. I've got it on my NHS England computer. No problems downloading it. It appears on your font list. It works in PowerPoint, Excel, Word, and it takes 2 minutes and it's free. And what you can see, I can read it fine, but what it's got is weighted letters. So at the bottom, they're kind of like weighted down, and apparently that holds the letters in place so they don't jump around on screen. So actually a really simple thing you can do is produce a material using this typeface, because then you're just being inclusive. For autism, Here are some examples: providing access to quiet spaces at work, providing noise cancelling headphones. You can get headphones that cancel just background noise, really, really valuable to people. Providing access to courses and support around things like organisation, time management. A big one for me, giving permission to miss social events. Like, social events cause so much anxiety in me. I do them because I do enjoy them, weirdly, but I find them overwhelming, quite hard because of my nature. So actually not making assumptions that there's something wrong if you're not being really sociable and doing the social things that everybody else is doing, because actually it's highlighting that and targeting that person. In the physical space, providing subtle lighting, providing a standing or a specific desk, so avoidance of the hot desking if you can, which is really challenging in the NHS space, I know that. Ergonomic equipment provision, access to windows and fresh air, flexible working in terms of hours, in terms of routine, but also in terms of a quiet space, which could be a remote working space. Allowing cameras to be off sometimes in meetings. It is perfectly acceptable to do that. And I still see and hear people saying, turn your cameras on, quite aggressively. And actually, it's quite hard being on Teams all day. It can be quite overwhelming. So actually permission to do that and for it to be okay. Things around, again, providing questions on paper or beforehand for interviews, and doing that for everybody. What a nice thing to do. An important thing for me is using clear and direct language with clear timescales when we're asking people to do things. Now, this is really valuable to me as an individual. Another example of the wider benefit to others. So, for example, it'd be great if you could do that audit report for me, thanks. And then not saying anything else, it's not particularly helpful. But you could rephrase it and say, can you write the audit report for me? Can you send it to me and copy in person X by 5 o'clock on Friday? I need it to include this content, X, Y, Z, etc. Can you see that's really clear? And also verbally asking, but following up in an email. I always actually ask people to do that, but that can be really valuable. And there's just small little changes that we can make to make things better for people. Here's an example of my learning. So on the left, for anyone from histopathology, that's my background. I wrote a gallbladder SOP about 15 years ago. Comic Sans, don't do that. But actually, from a couple of years ago, here's a protocol. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It's text-based, it's text-heavy. The one on the right-hand side is exactly the same information as the middle one, but it's produced in a partly visual style, and it's easier to read, it's more accessible. So I'm not saying do one or the other, but actually if you include components of text-based, but also some visuals, it can be really helpful to people. And colour as well is quite useful. Here's an example of some of my work with trainees. I've been given permission to share this. So working with a trainee on the registration portfolio. So on the left-hand side, when we started, we'd have meetings, and this was the write-up of it. And it's very text-based. We'd have some actions at the bottom with the blue circle around it, but it was still very text-based about what we'd talked about, what we needed to do. And actually, we found stuff wasn't happening. So we, instead of me making an assumption or just saying, why is it not happening? Why are you not doing it? And being critical and judging, I actually spoke to the trainee and said, what's not working for you? What can we change? So we introduced some colour. We also, you can see the yellow is the things to be done, the action plan bit. So it's highlighted, so it's more visible. And then it still wasn't quite working. What else can we do to make it better? So on the right-hand side, it's the same information as in the middle one, but alongside the written notes, a very, very specific action plan. So pulling out the actions, and there's a diary bit at the top, and when stuff needs to be done by, and when we're meeting next, highlighted in colour, so it's really sort of shining at the trainee. And they would print that out and they would stick it on their wall. And I'm really happy to say they're registered now, and this worked for them. And I think this is a really powerful example of co-creation. And how it's important not to just make assumptions on what the person needs or what will work for them, but to ask them and to co-create things with people. Here's an example for any biomedical scientists in the room. This is part of the questions that you have to ask during the verification for the registration portfolio. And so I write them down. And I say to people, would you like them written down? And as I'm asking them, they have them in front of them as well. And that can be really beneficial to people. Now, a really big lesson for me as I do that on white background, black writing. And actually, one of my trainees with ADHD and dyslexia, I said, how would this work for you? And I made the assumption they'd want black writing on white. And they said to me, can I have white, like off-white writing on off-black background? And it was completely different to me. And I was like, okay, but it's really nice. And now I use it and I take it to all verifications and it feels really inclusive. So that took me about 5 minutes. That is a big change and difference you can make to someone's life with 5 minutes work. Here is an example for back to the executive functioning of actually some of not the challenges, but actually the things you can put in place to support people. So asking people what they need, not judging people, actually trying to understand what the need is, rather than saying, why haven't you done this? Using visual stimuli, really, really helpful. Setting boundaries around kind of activities, removing distractions. That's a big one for me. My phone has to be away from me because I'm really distracted easily by it. Regulation of emotions. The biggest one for me was, if someone really made me angry, I would type an email response, send. And I learned through experience not to do that and to actually sit with my emotions, write it, put it in drafts, and if I still wanted to send it, maybe send it the next day. Never send an email when you're angry. But actually emotional regulation can be really challenging for people with ADHD. So those kind of skills, it's really useful to support people with. Breaking down big tasks into smaller chunks. So the STP is a really good example of that. A big overview, big 3-year program, so much to do, so many plates to spin. Break it down into small, manageable chunks. I used to do the same for the registration portfolio as well, and that can be really beneficial. Sorry, I'm distracted by Elaine's. That's really interesting. I'll have a look at that later. Self-awareness, journaling can be really useful. Promoting reflection. It's easy for me to say I'm a high reflector. I find reflection really easy, but I know that others don't. And motivation. I would find that people wouldn't get stuff done, or they do stuff at the last minute. And I find that quite difficult because I do things with plenty of time. I'm a planner. I do things early. And I found that really difficult when people are last minute. But actually, I learned that it's linked to kind of a dopamine hit. And actually, people with ADHD may choose to work like that because that works for them. And actually, for me, a big thing was acceptance, that that's okay, that people work differently to me. Here's just all of that information in a picture, which you can download from that website. It's supposed to be like a scaffolding support. So some of the challenges on the bottom, and then what you can do to support on the top. Just an example around recruitment, how we often recruit with a neurotypical approach, standard questions, standard panel, verbal questions. Do we get the right candidate? If we think about an inclusive approach, a diverse panel from the start who does an EDI impact assessment, blended process where we just don't ask verbal questions, but where we do ask questions, give them to everyone beforehand, put them on screen when we're asking them. These are small things we can do and that we're starting to see happen that can, I think, help us to get the best candidate. Because, I'm sure neurotypical people are wonderful, but we don't need a fully neurotypical workforce. We don't need a fully neurodivergent workforce. We need a combination because differences bring the best results. Some other adjustments you can make. Things around distractions, things around desk partition, so creating that kind of safe space, that quiet space. Managing notifications around when you expect people to respond from the barrage of messages that we get from different platforms. Mentoring and coaching, I think, is really valuable. And also when we learn things, to not keep it to ourselves, but to share it with others so we can all learn together. I think that's really important. And some of these adjustments can be specific for people, but actually many of these could be offered to all people as we move towards neuroinclusivity. And I just put in this slide, as a coach, I'm really passionate about coaching as well, but I couldn't help but notice that coaching is about co-creation and it's about listening. two of the biggest skills I think you need to support the neurodivergent workforce. So I just included this slide because I think it's really great. And the link, you can find it at that link at the bottom. Here are some of the many resources that I've discovered over the years. The podcasts are the top in the left, but also these books. If you're interested in education, the Neurodiversity in Education book is really good. I would really recommend following Amanda Kirby on LinkedIn. It's a wealth of resources that I'm learning something new every day. If you're worried about your mobile phone being in the way, read Stolen Focus. I'd really recommend that. So there are some examples there. Here are some websites and apps that may be useful if you want to know more about high sensitivity. I would really recommend those two short TED Talks on the right. They were absolutely life-changing for me. As Andy said, it was Neurodiversity Celebration Week in March. When I was researching that, I came across their website. Each of those pictures is a screenshot from their website. Each of those smaller thumbnails is a document that's on there, and there's a wealth of information about all kinds of neurodiversity on there. So I'd really recommend a dive into that website. This is a recently published Buckland Review of Autism. It's a really good report because it has lots of recommendations and examples, and it came out at the end of February. I would really, really recommend a read of this if you want to think of ideas of how to implement supportive changes in the workplace. This is an NHS England Neurodiversity Toolkit, which was created for nurses, but it actually has some things that may apply. And there's also Oliver McGowan training. Now, I did have a look, and you can access this with a personal email, the Oliver McGowan training. So I don't think it's England-centric. And the links to it are at the bottom there. This is just if you do happen to have any STP, HSSD trainees. There are lots of resources on the National School. And actually, if you don't, there are lots of useful resources on there as well. So please do have a look around the website. I left this slide in because even if you don't have any trainees, actually, if you're thinking, where do I get help? I think the top aspect of this is really important. So the, ideas within your department, if people are at university, there's a wealth of experience and knowledge in universities, occupational health, human resources, organisational development as well, and you may have an EDI lead. So there are many, many places you can go to for support, and increasingly organisations will have policies around EDI and neurodiversity. And there are loads of things on the school website as well. So just a few red flags. Try to avoid saying we're all a little bit. It can be really invalidating for a person who is impacted with challenges from being neurodivergent. And be cautious about giving people labels and generalizing what they are challenged by and what they may be able to do, because we are all individuals, and what one person is strong at and weak at will be completely different for another person. So with that in mind, not pushing a particular practice or pathway or app, because not everything works for people, and they may have already tried it, and that can be frustrating. Not assuming, again, that general guidance works for everyone. Co-creation and asking is the most important thing I can share with you today. And also, because we generally, we care for people, we want to get the best for them, but we have to be careful that we don't exhibit misplaced paternalism, and that's making those assumptions about what people can do and cope with, because we might be trying to protect them, but what we can do as a result is not give them opportunities in the first place, which is not helpful. So let people decide for themselves what they can and can't cope with. And also, don't expect neurotypical people to make unreasonable adjustments, because actually that can really, really single out the neurodivergent people and lead to feelings of shame. A really good example of that is if the neurodivergent person is struggling with noise, and you could offer headphones. The alternative would be to say to everybody else in the big shared space, you're not allowed to talk. Not helpful. So think about what works for everybody. And you can make a difference, honestly, you really can, as individuals and teams. I think the place to start is by learning more. There are many resources out there I've given you examples of, but asking people how you can help them and support them, utilising what people's strengths are. Some great strengths that neurodivergent people have that we can bring into healthcare science, and normalise talking about neurodiversity. It can be really scary because we're scared of getting it wrong. And it'd be really easy to just park it and not say anything. But we need to be brave, and we need to make this a normal thing that we talk about, because that's how we'll get change. Supporting, respecting ways of working and learning that are different to your own is really important, and being mindful of our language, because it can really damage people. What we're really trying to do is to create psychological safety for others so that we can do that co-creation piece together. And when we've done that learning, talk to other people, raise that awareness in others, because it's like a ripple effect. And I thought about how we can reframe neurodiversity. So we're trying to move to a more social model. But actually, if we think about biodiversity, we think about that as a normal part of life. Here's a lovely picture of some mushrooms, some fungi, biodiversity. We accept the differences. And actually, what we should be doing is looking at the neurodiversity, the normal differences and variation in humans, and accepting that as just a normal part of life as well. So in summary, neurodivergent people bring as much value to work as neurotypical people. And I think there's a real area of growth potential for healthcare science. And we all, as individuals, have a responsibility here. We all speak different but equally valid languages. And we need to support others so they don't feel shamed, so they don't have to advocate for themselves. And I think the place to start is to improve our own understanding and compassion towards others. And those small changes that we can make, those 2-minute changes, 5-minute changes, can make a huge impact to individual people's lives. And if we do that together, it is like a ripple, like an acorn. It grows into an oak tree. And then we can influence change within our departments, our teams, our organisations, our countries. And we need to support people who have neurodivergent diagnoses, but also move towards that social model where we talk about it, where we appreciate and understand difference, and we try and make things better for everybody. Here are a load of references of all the things I've talked about. It will take you a while to get through those. And this is my final slide. I'm so thrilled to have finished in time. I would finish by saying there's no standard normal. Normal is subjective, and there are 8 billion versions of normal on this planet. So thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr, Armando. And I say that because what's easy for me to read, to speak, to understand may not be the same for you. And please feel free to get in touch. I'm always happy to talk about this subject. Thank you.